It's Ghost Queen. It's the beginning of Beltane. I'm starting to get my little bonfire going behind me. I know I'm late with my Path of the Crone series, so I'm going to do another brief installment tonight. What better night than Beltane? So I'm going to just talk briefly about parenting and raising babies and small children, how I did it, how, in my personal worldview, I believe it should be done. I was an attachment parent. I nursed all four of my children. I breastfed each one a little longer each time until my last child, whom I nursed until she was just past the age of 3. I wanted her to be my first child to self-wean until it got to the point where I thought maybe she would self-wean about, college age. So I did actually wean her myself in the end. She was past 3. I didn't feel she really needed it anymore. So yeah, I did wean her. So I've added it up. I've spent 8 years of my life or something crazy nursing. It's craziness. So yeah, I did breastfeed 4 children. I practiced attachment parenting. I co-slept, practiced the family bed. I cloth diapered my last 2 children. That was fun. I baby wore, so I used slings and all sorts of different pouches and things like that. I definitely support baby wearing. Yeah, I was really into my parenting. It was really special. Each child was special, still is, obviously. But I loved parenting. Probably Wayne and I would even have had a child together. But I've been through menopause, so yeah, that's just not a possibility for me anymore. And I am 50. We are getting older. Both Wayne and I regret that we didn't meet when we were young, because maybe both of our lives would have gone a different way if we had had children together and met when we were younger. But alas, it was not meant to be, and we've met now. So he also had 2 children at a pretty young age. So yeah, I did not circumcise my son. I'm anti-circumcision. I don't believe in circumcising baby boys. I think it's an unnecessary procedure. I did not hold that view until after I had had my son, and I spoke to my OBGYN, who essentially admitted to me it is a cosmetic procedure and it's not necessary. And since we had had a difficult birth, I didn't want to put my son through anything, painful and unnecessary. So I did not circumcise him. And I then I was kind of backwards. I made the decision to not circumcise. Then I did all my research just to make sure I was making the right decision. And I was so grateful that I did make the right decision, in my opinion, because I think I would have had a lot of guilt had I circumcised him. And I've spoken to a lot of mothers who now have a lot of guilt, and that's sad. So I was involved. I ran 2 nonprofits involved with that type of activism in the past. Yeah, my parenting was huge to me. I did have a special needs child as well. So the first decade of his life was primarily that was my job. I had to leave my career. I ran a crew agency in the yachting industry when my son was born. My career was enormously important to me. I made terrific money. It was my dream job. It was a fun job. I loved my job. I loved my life. I certainly loved the money that I made. But when my son was born, we had an emergency birth. My placenta had ruptured in 2 places. and the cord was around the neck a few times. I worked up until the day before I delivered. I was getting ready to go to the Y to swim, and my husband was helping me get my pants off. My water broke. I went to the hospital, and I had been planning a water birth. I had birthed my first 2 children naturally without medication or anything, with the same midwife. And I was planning a water birth for my son with a midwife, a different one though, because I was in Rhode Island now. And unfortunately, she wasn't as earthy crunchy as my first midwife. And when my water broke and I wasn't going into labor, she told me it was like the law or something. I had to have the baby within 48 hours after my water broke. But I wasn't going into labor, and they weren't letting me go home to take care of this on my own. In retrospect, I wish I had insisted. But, it is what it is. You can't go back in time. So they convinced me to have Pitocin. It didn't put me into active labor. So they upped the dosage, and essentially everything started to go awry. They wheeled me into, I ended up having to have an epidural, which that went very badly. It was all bad. So I had a fetal scalp monitor on my son's head while he was still inside of me. His blood pressure dipped dangerously low. My blood pressure dipped dangerously low. It was getting very hairy, and, by the end of it, I was sort of like floppy, like a rag doll. And so they wheeled me into have an emergency C-section I was on all fours on the table as they wheeled me in, because it was the only position I could be in. I was in so much pain and agony. So they knocked me out, gave me an emergency C-section. My son was born blue and not breathing. The last thing I heard before they put me out too was like, we gotta get him out, there's no heartbeat, we gotta get him out. So I kind of thought I was gonna wake up to a dead baby. Not fun. And when I did wake up, within an hour I had my son in my arms and was nursing. They did have to bag him to get him to breathe, but within about 15 minutes he pinked up. And I stayed in the hospital with him for 5 days. I co-slept in the hospital. I wouldn't let him out of my sight. They even came to take him to do a hearing test, and I followed because I just wasn't going to let that baby out of my sight. And after 5 days, we went home. But they watched him very carefully because the birth had been so difficult. And I guess it was around the age of 4 months we noticed some issues. He wasn't using his right arm a lot. He wasn't using his arms and hands midline together like you should. So there were things we were concerned about, and at first we thought maybe it was cerebral palsy. I had a wonderful pediatrician, and we watched him very closely. He started OT and PT at the age of 6 months. His legs were stiff, he wouldn't bend them. But I really didn't get an autism diagnosis. I think it was around the age of 1.5 years. I started having some educators and some people in there was a special program we were in that was like under the age of 2, early intervention, I think it was called. And they were suggesting to me that it could be autism. So, of course, then I started madly researching. And, it was a long journey. He didn't get a diagnosis of Asperger's until he was in grade school. So, I remember once reading a book written by a woman in Amherst, Massachusetts, and I think it was called The Boy Who Loved to Stare at Windows. And I remember saying to my husband at the time, I'm going to write a book called The Boy Who Loves to Smash Windows, because he had smashed like 14 windows in our house. It was a challenge raising an autistic child, a real big challenge, a joy as well, but also a challenge. And I have many friends who went through that whole thing with me. And I just reconnected actually with one of my girlfriends who was in the parenting group that I was in. We had babies at the same time. And she was like, Heather, you know, I've never seen anyone fight as hard for their child as you did for him. And, you know, it was really nice to hear. It was nice to get that validation. So it's a hard path. It's a, you know, and you don't get a lot of pats on the back. You do a lot of fighting for your child. And you don't necessarily make a lot of friends doing that. So it was nice to get a little validation from my girlfriend and a little reminder that there were a lot of people along the way who appreciated how hard I was working. So at any rate, I did take him to work with me. I went back, I stayed home for 3 months after he was born. I then took him to work with me for a year because luckily I worked in an office by myself and I was able to do that. I never put any of my children in any kind of care, you know, from birth to school age. I just didn't believe in that and wasn't something I was prepared to do. So I took my son to work with me for a year, and then it just got too hard to run run the business I was running and care for my son, who was getting, harder and harder to manage in the office. So I decided I needed to go back home. And then I found out I was pregnant again, and so I went back home, and pretty much I haven't worked outside the home since. I've done a couple of things here and there, and I've definitely done educational things throughout that time. But raising my son, and my daughter, but my son certainly took a lot more of my focus, was my job for all those years. And up until this, business I'm running now with Wayne, that we're starting together, that's been my job. So, yeah, that's a little bit about my parenting. I'm a firm believer in doing things the natural way. And I now kind of think like Pitocin is the devil. I think that a lot of what they do in modern OBGYN care is just, they're making things a lot worse and not making good decisions. I think too many women are having cesareans, etc. And I think this is kind of, the medical industry, you got to remember their goal is to make money. So you can't always trust them. And yeah, so that's it. That's a little bit about my parenting philosophy. If you're parenting any young children or infants or that sort of thing, I've done it. I've done it all. If you ever need a shoulder, I know how hard it is. I know it's a lot of work. And I know most people don't realize how much work it is until they're in it. And my nose is already starting to run because I'm outside and my allergies are kicking up. But that's it. Natural parenting, I'm all for it. Attachment parenting, I'm all about it. So that's it, guys. That's my next installment. I know I said I would do one once a week. Of course, that was a little optimistic. But I will continue with these as I have time to. So hope everybody's having a great week. Love you guys. Sorry I'm so nasally. Blessed Beltane to those who celebrate it. And I will see you soon. I bid you adieu.